I'm Ryan, and today we are going to work on an acrylic landscape lesson. All of the tools and materials will be listed in the video description, and if you'd like help with the drawing process, I'll have the traceable up over on Patreon, along with the reference photo for color matching. With that said, let's jump into it. We're going to begin here today with a 1-inch flat-headed brush because it can hold a good amount of paint and it leaves a relatively consistent application, which is what we're looking for here. Now, all I have on my palette to begin with is some Mars Black, and I'm just going to apply a very light application of this over the entirety of the canvas. I'm going to be painting a night sky, and I want to make sure that it is nice and dark. Acrylic paints are semi-transparent, and that means this darker base layer will show through a little bit, which is really quite convenient. It'll allow us to build up our highlights slowly over time and create a lot of depth while doing so. It's also worth noting that my brush is semi-damp right now. I have a little bit of water on it, and that's just helping me move my paint along much farther than I normally be able to. And it's ensuring that it doesn't dry as quickly as well. Once I get a larger area applied, I'm going back over it a number of times with horizontal strokes, and I'm using a very light application to do that, because if you apply a lot of pressure generally, you'll create a bit more of a streaky aesthetic. You'll also create little start and stops with your pigment. There you can see 2 of them. They're very subtle, but you don't have to have them, and you can work around it. It's also worth noting that you don't have to start with a white canvas and paint it black. You can start with a black canvas from the art store or the craft store. They are becoming significantly more common, but I figured not everyone will have access to them, so I would show you how we go about this with a white canvas. With that said, I am just going to finish painting this. I'm going to let it dry fully, and then we'll jump into the next step together. So, while we wait for the canvas to dry, I would highly recommend going and cleaning your brush thoroughly, as well as your dish of water, because we're now going to start working with some colors, and if we were to take that brush, mix with our colors, use that brush in that water, we'd probably dilute that pigment before it even got to the canvas, and we wouldn't get anything as bright or as vibrant as we want. So it's highly important that when you're working with a lot of very dark pigments and then you go to mix with lighter pigments, that you do switch your brushes, that you do switch your water, or at least clean them. So that's what I'm going to do, and then I will be right back. So it's been about 15 minutes and the canvas is now fully dry to the touch. So I'm going to take a 1/2-inch flat-headed brush, just like this, and we can start working on the detail. Now it's worth noting that this brush here is synthetic, and I'm actually going to begin by just peeling back some of the bristles here. That way I get a bit of a disheveled look, and when I make a tapping motion with this brush on canvas, I render just a litany of different impressions. Each one of these bristles will represent a very tiny star, and all of these markings are going to be smaller than that of what we could have rendered naturally by just using a smaller brush and tapping them on. So this one will create just hundreds of little applications in seconds, and it's an incredibly easy way of doing so, and it also randomizes those applications so things look natural. It is worth noting that you do want your brush to be fully dry for this process, because the addition of water will taper in and keep all of those bristles together. So with that, we can now mix some paint and start having some fun. So on my palette here, I have some titanium white, Mars Black, and Cerulean Blue. I'm going to use my larger 1-inch flat-headed brush to do a lot of this initial mixing, because I don't want the pigment here to condense and compress all of the bristles we just worked so hard to move out. So I'm going to start by using about 1/2 and 1/2 with a Mars Black and Cerulean Blue. Then I'll interject just the smallest amount of titanium white. That titanium white is going to work with the Mars Black to create a bit of a gray and desaturate the blue a little bit, which is what we want, because this first layer is meant to be a base layer. It's not meant to be hyper saturated or vibrant. It's not meant to be extremely bright. It's essentially just a stepping stone and something to layer on to create some depth. So there I have a good base color. I'm going to put this aside and I'm going to grab the older disheveled brush. Then I'll move that around, grab a bit of that pigment, and I'll start around the middle of the canvas. I'll also get you a lot closer so you can see what this really looks like up close. So here we are. As you can see, it really isn't bright at all, but it is starting to create the illusion of clusters of light in the distance. Now, these are all exceedingly far away, so they are going to be a bit darker. And what we're trying to do is essentially create a randomized spotted pattern. We have this dark blue showing up, and then behind it and in between these strokes we have little bits of that black still. This is going to make it look like these are popping out and they are closer to us than the black, which is the first step in rendering depth in a starry night scene like this. You'll also notice that I'm consistently going back and grabbing more pigment because it's so important that we don't essentially just keep grabbing from where we have. I'm essentially never going over an area twice with this same color. We will go over it again later with different pigments, but we want to ensure that we don't cover too much space or too much of the black because we do still want a little bit of it showing through. And if we were to go over it with many layers, we simply wouldn't get the effect we wanted because we wouldn't have those openings, and therefore we wouldn't have the difference in values, and therefore we wouldn't have the depth we want to render. So again, this is incredibly subtle. It's meant to be. The more layers you build up slowly, the more intricate it will look. And to answer, I'm sure, a couple of your questions, yes, you could use a larger brush to get this done significantly more quickly, but by using a smaller brush like this, you give yourself more control and it allows you to think about things a bit more because you're not simply jumping in and getting it done. You're making adjustments. You have time to see if an area needs more of an application, if you need to use less of an application, if you need to perhaps take all of the pigment off your brush because the pigment has essentially condensed all of those bristles. Paint is wet, so like water, it can condense all of those peeled back little pieces. And if you find that's an issue, all you have to do is take the paint off, wash your brush, and then dry it extremely well. Then you can peel back those bristles and start again. Because we're not blending, we don't have to worry about this drying, we don't have to worry about time limit or time frame. With that said, I'm going to continue to take this same mixture and apply it to the entirety of the canvas. Then we'll jump into the next layer together. So I finished applying all of those little applications and then yet again I let it fully dry. Now we're going to take that 1-inch flat-headed brush, some cerulean blue, and a little bit less than an equal amount of Mars black. We're going to slowly build up the brightness of these mixtures, and I'm going to mix this right beside our initial application. That way I know what it'll look like when it's built on top of it. And the goal again is just to progressively make it a little bit brighter. So now I'm going back to that older flat-headed brush. Since then I have washed it, so I do need to peel those bristles back. I'll grab some of that pigment. I'll start in the middle, and yet again we'll start building this out. So here we can start seeing some of that saturation in the pigment. Initially, because the pigment was so dark and we were working on top of black, a lot of that was lost, and again, that's exactly what we want. We have a lot of room to go, and the more you do this, the more you build up these small layers, the better the piece will look. Yes, you could paint the canvas black, then go in with a fairly bright blue and get a very distinct high contrast application immediately. But you really would lack a lot of subtlety, which is rather easily achievable if you're willing to put in a little bit of extra time. I'm no stranger to quick paintings. We have done, I believe, 90-ish 10-minute paintings in the past. A lot of them did involve starry night skies, and it is something you can do quickly, but taking your time and going at it with this approach really will render significantly better results. With that said, yet again, I am simply going to continuously take more of this pigment, and I'm going to work it over the entirety of the canvas, leaving slight openings in between my applications, and I'm still rotating my brush in between each little tap. That way they're all different and it's evolving. Once you complete that layer, you should have something that's a little bit brighter, but also probably a little bit splotchy as well. Don't worry about that. That is part of the layering process, and we will eventually get rid of that. But our next layer needs to be even brighter, so I'm going back to that larger brush. I'm grabbing quite a bit of cerulean blue. Not going to grab much Mars black at all this time, and I'm going to grab significantly more titanium white. Yet again, I'm mixing this next to our other colors, that way I get to see how different it will look. Then we'll put that aside, grab our regular brush, start in the middle, and yet again we'll start working our way out. This will probably be our last general layer before we start getting into motions, details, leading lines, and all of that. So just make sure that you are still giving it your all. I know when we do a fair number of layers that are all relatively similar, that all use fairly similar techniques, it can get a little mundane, but you know, if you put on a podcast, some music you enjoy, it can be a really cathartic, relaxing process, and I highly implore you to make sure that you are enjoying this, that you are taking your time, and that you're getting the coverage and the detail that you really want. So yet again, just working my way out and building a significantly brighter sky that still has those two initial layers showing through in the background. Here we are, significantly closer, and I just thought I would show you how my brush is kind of bouncing off the canvas, and how whenever I have a chance I'm rotating it slightly in the air so that the applications are a little bit different. If you're also finding that you're getting a very consistent application and it's noticeable how each tap is being applied, a good trick to getting it to be more random and sporadic is to jump to different areas of the canvas. That way you have to move your arm, your body, your wrist, how you're applying it, and that generally gives you a little bit of a reset, and the techniques tend to change, so you can bounce back and forth between different areas, and this will also slightly randomize the opacity of your applications, because generally when we first grab pigment and we apply that to the canvas, we get something quite opaque. It's very bright, it's definitely akin to the blue that we have on our palette, but as we continue to use the pigment, as you can see here, it becomes more and more transparent, you can see more of the black, and it's less stark. So, by jumping around, we help ensure that we don't have a bright spot and then it slowly gets darker on all of the edges. It brings back that randomized effect that's just so good. And again, if you find that you have a bit of a splotchy aesthetic initially, to the point that you don't like it, wait for the middle area to dry with this highlight, and then jump back in there and try to fill in some of the darker areas so that it's a bit more consistent. There we go. Having slight movements and shapes in here though can be a really, really nice effect. With that said, I'm just going to continue applying this, and once this layer is done, we'll talk about how we're really going to make this interesting. So now we have a very full amalgamation of little blue dots, and it's time to start diversifying. So I'm going to take some more cerulean blue, titanium white, and just a hint of Mars black. As you can see, we are still brightening that pigment, and you can see it in relation to the last pigment right there. So it's always important to recognize that the pigment that we mix on our palette is going to be a little bit different, a little bit darker on the actual painting because acrylics are semi-transparent, and when you apply them, you can see through them a little bit, and when you have darker pigments underneath, that's what you see. But right now, I'm going to start creating a set of stars that are even brighter. Ones to really capture the attention of the sky, and I'm going to move them in this general direction. We're going to be doing a line of sorts, and I'll kind of show you how we're moving with that. Like so. I am leaving openings, and I'm actually leaving more openings than I have in the past. I don't want this to look consistent. I do want there to be splotchy areas. I want there to be connective areas, like that. And I'm also going to go over areas a number of times if I want them to be brighter, because the more we apply additional layers here, the more we're going to build up that opaque, brighter bottom and foundation, and therefore we'll be adding highlight on top of highlight rather than highlight on top of the darker values that we've kind of established elsewhere. So I'm letting my brush run out of pigment fully as we do this. That way I get one initial real splash of this bright blue, and then as I continue to work it out, I get this softer light. These stars that are more prominent than this, but less prominent than that, and it allows us to render gradients. And I'll get you a bit closer for us to talk about that. So up close here, as you can see, we have this middle area, and it's significantly more opaque. You have this bluish white pigment, has a bit of a glow on the edges, and that glow, that dissipating light that you create, that's a gradient. It's done via a series of taps rather than a smooth, clean gradient that we normally get in the sky, but it still has the same effect. It makes it look like there's a large patch of light here, and then that light glows in all directions, and we have some other slightly closer stars as well that are helping with that. And this is another way of building depth in a starry night sky. Oh, that looks really pretty. I like that. But essentially you apply that main highlight, and then you start to work out in all directions. Your pigment eventually dissipates. You start to move less and less out, therefore the highlight gets more transparent. You don't have that strong opaque effect, and you get this nice glow. See that? This is also going to soften the sky as well, because we're adding an almost whitish blue on top of our bluish black, and when that white moves over the black with a non-fully opaque layer, then we get an optical blend, and one that renders more of a gray, which can be really, really beautiful. But here, as you can see, I'm still moving these highlights out in different ways. I'm building on top. Here you can see a bit of a line. It takes a slight break, then there's more of a line. And it's all incredibly subtle, at least at this point. You just want to create the general line here, and you want it composed of lots of small lines, but also interesting shapes like what we have right here. It's more of a triangular shape than an actual line, but it continues to lead the eye up this way. And that's really what we're trying to do. We're trying to add a highlight more so in the bottom of the canvas, but we want to lead it up into the top. That way it doesn't feel like we're breaking the canvas in half. This way we're moving the eye through the composition, and it doesn't feel like it gets stuck at one place or another. There we go. Getting about as high as I want it to. But you can also take very minimal amounts of this highlight once you've used the majority of it in here, and you can kind of splash it in different areas of the painting to diversify that background a little bit and make it something a bit more interesting. Initially we started with trying to make it cohesive and similar, and now that we're a bit farther along and we have that foundation in there, we can start making it something really special. And remember, we will line the edges of this with trees, and I do have another technique to add a lot of the additional stars in a minute. This is really just the background layer. I say that, the background layer, the background set of layers. We've done quite a number of these thus far, and as a friendly reminder, the more subtle layers you do like this, building up to this fourth one, the more captivating the piece will be. So as we move back, we can really start to see the movements in here. So we have a line like that, and then we have a break, and then we have that triangular shape, and then we have a break, and then we have this arching shape right here, and then we have a break. Then we have another arch right there that's longer and reaches a bit higher. We also have this separate set of them as well. This one is really two pieces. We have one that goes like this, and then one right there. We have another that dips in and then comes back out. So there's a lot happening in this. It's not doing the same thing over and over again. I do recommend using a reference photo if you feel like it's getting a little too visually samey. I'll include a number of them up in the Patreon post for you to kind of work off of. But essentially, you just want to continuously diversify. You want to create different abstract shapes in here, and you want that light to be sweeping up in this general direction. With that, we are now going to build a highlight on top of it. So I still have quite a bit of wet pigment here. I'm going to simply take titanium white, get a good mixture. I'm leaving a slight bit of that initial pigment on the edge. That way I can make sure that this middle area is in fact brighter and what we want. Put that mixing brush down. Grab our regular brush, and then I'll go into the heart of some of these shapes, and I'll start applying even more highlight. This is going to build up that light. We can even move out into the glows, and it's at this point where things start to look a little bit more like stars. Admittedly, up until this point, they didn't. They aren't supposed to. I talk about this in so many lessons, but a lot of acrylic painting is about building layers, and those first layers generally don't look like the subject you want to render in the end, but that's okay, and that's honestly how it's meant to be. Don't get discouraged through those stages. There we go. I'm looking for the most dense, most opaque clusters, heading into the center of them, and then working out in all of the directions that are kind of pre-established with a slightly lighter blue. There we go. Here you can see we're continuing to move out. add some extra highlights around there. Wonderful. And you can really play with this. The amount of highlight you add is really up to you. The amount you spread out the light is really up to you. You could have a high contrast set of stars here and only apply this light right in that middle area, but you can also soften things by taking very minimal amounts, as I am right now, and moving them out into the other sides. This is really something that you can get lost in though and just do for hours, honestly. It's so cathartic. Now our next step is going to require a lot of very bright, non-diluted pigment. So what we're going to do is go and clean both of our brushes and our water quite well while we let our painting dry. This is honestly just such a good thing to get in a habit of. It will make a massive difference in your painting process, especially if you start working with other more delicate colors like that of yellows. We're not going to be doing that anytime soon in this painting, but again, it's something really good to remind yourself to do really every 15-20 minutes, or if you're about to switch colors into something that is a bit brighter, like a yellow or a white. Now we're going to switch to a smaller brush, and here I have 3 different options, all of which will render the same effect. And here I have a small round-headed brush, here we have a liner brush, and then this is a round pointed brush. Really, any of these will work. You just need something that has a bit of a longer bristle and not a wide body. So I'm actually going to pick the middle one right here. I'll grab some pigment and we'll start painting some stars in probably the most conventional way. Step number 1 is making sure that this brush is really quite nice and damp. We can wipe off a little bit of the excess water on the edge here, but we want the majority of it still in the brush. Now we're going to take some titanium white and a small, very small hint of our cerulean blue. We'll mix those two together right here on our palette, and you can see it's quite transparent. Then I'm going to go grab some additional water, add that to my brush, and work it back into our mixture. This is going to give it the consistency of watercolor. I'm going to put my palette down, I'm going to peel back my bristles, and I'm going to launch a couple of stars here on the canvas. We didn't get too many with that first application. This is something that can take a little bit of practice, but it is a technique that can render some really neat effects. And you can actually change the way the stars fly at the canvas. But this is essentially, once you get it, a really easy way of just rendering hundreds of stars extremely quickly, and doing so in a randomized fashion with incredibly small applications that, again, you really wouldn't be able to do with a brush in any other way. So here you can see they are starting to find their way on there, and this is something that you'll probably want to do maybe 50 times for a sky like this, but it isn't doing the same thing over and over again. You're going to want to do this first wider application a fair number of times, as you can see I'm doing, but eventually you're going to want to create additional stars along this line. When you do that, you're going to line your brush up with that. You're going to peel the bristles back really close to the canvas, and then you're going to start making that little flicking motion. Here we'll grab more, we'll get nice and close, and I'll start applying that along the edge. But here you can see I'm still keeping the brush in the same line as it. You can also create larger stars and smaller stars depending upon the amount of water you use and how far away you are from the canvas when you do that motion. I'm also incorporating a little bit of blue into this. That way it isn't a pure white, and we get something a bit more interesting and something cohesive with what we already have on the canvas. Grab more. And after this, I'll get you quite a bit closer so you can see the detail work that's occurring. But I did want to note before we get to that, if you are about to attempt this, make sure that whatever you have behind your canvas physically is something you're okay with getting a little bit of white paint on, or just put down a sheet over whatever furniture or flooring you may have. I'm personally able to get it off the floor that I'm currently working on quite easily, so it's not a concern for me here, but I have in the past gotten this all over monitors and cameras, so if that's something that worries you, do be cognizant of that which is around your painting space. With that said, let's get a little bit closer and you can see the technique from a bit more of a detailed perspective. So, yet again, we'll grab more of that pigment, put our palette down, get nice and close, and here I'm starting to just work on some directional pieces, like that. Sometimes when you make those first couple of flicks, you don't really get much, but if you continue, you might find a spot on the brush where it's much easier to accomplish that. So don't give up after the first couple of tries. Do continue to add pigment. And here I'm just continuously going back, grabbing more water, and there we go. Again, this is another process that you could do rather quickly. You don't have to do all of these different mixes. You don't have to worry about angles, but if you do, you will get a more interesting piece in the end. Here we're still painting with purpose, and that's something to consider whenever you're working on your painting. If you are simply painting, if you're simply applying paint without thought, or if there is purpose to each application. I think generally, a lot of people kind of innately think of purposeful painting as painting with brush strokes, because you have to think about how all of those strokes are moving, how it's making it dynamic, leading lines, all of that. And when you go into a tapping or kind of flinging paint, it's kind of this thing that doesn't require thought or attention, but really, in all actuality, if you want something great, you probably still want that attention. You want to think about how these applications are being made, why you're applying them in certain areas, what areas you want to be brighter, what areas you want to be darker, and really all of that. Here we are getting quite a good application with this. And this is where it really starts to become something special. Anyways, this is a process that does take some time, so I'm probably going to spend another 15-20 minutes just applying these stars. And I will see you for our next step. So here we have the finished sky, which I am incredibly pleased with. I feel like that last application really brought it all together and made it something that felt like it was glowing, something special. But with that, we are going to move on. We're going to start painting the trees, but I didn't want to just jump in and start painting trees because I wanted to make sure that everything was where it should be, that I had a good diversity in there, that there was spacing between the trees, that we had different movements within the trees. All of these different things do add up and make a significantly more captivating piece. So I did take the time, I sketched it in, and I did so with a little piece of white Conte. I love using this for drawing on canvases that already have pigment because it allows me to allocate new colors, and it's really easy to take off. You can just take your finger and just wipe it away. It's so easy. If you have a little bit of water on your finger, it's even easier. So just a thought for you if you do want to go ahead and draw on this is something else. It's also worth noting that generally charcoal and graphite do dilute pigment, and these don't tend to. So it's a great great little thing to try. But with that, if you do support the channel over on Patreon, I will have the traceable up there, so you will have the drawing exactly as I have it, and I'll also include the reference photo which I worked from. With that said, we are now going to jump into painting these trees and making this piece really something interesting. So now we're going to take a smaller pointed round-headed brush. This one is about 1/8 of an inch, and I'm going to make sure that it's nice and damp. From there, I'll grab some Mars Black, get my brush yet again nice and clean, nice and damp, and we'll head in to the top of this tree right here. We are going to apply very small, very soft applications, and we want all of these branches to be nice and original. Going to follow the white drawing that I did initially, and I'm going to create a silhouetted look for our tree. We may go in later and build on that, give it some color and additional depth, but let's keep it simple to begin with and build a base we know we like. So I'm always starting right here in the middle. I work my way out, and as I move outwards with my applications, I try really hard to make sure that they get smaller and smaller. So I continuously relieve pressure with my brush. That way that mark does taper. If you apply a lot of pressure initially, you'll find that your stroke is quite large, because the harder you push, the more pressure you add, the more your bristles tend to stick together and then leaf out. So especially close to the top here, where we do want the tree tapering, we are going to make sure it's really small and subtle. I'm also going to start connecting some of our pieces of foliage here, some of our branches, and I'm also going to leave small openings in there like that one. Then I might go back to the edges of some of these larger areas when I have a lot of very watery pigment, and I'll create some extra applications there. If you do decide you want it to be a bit more sparse than your initial drawing, you don't have to go over the entirety of it. You can just wash away the white a little bit later on. But we do need the base here to dry fully before we do that. Otherwise, that additional water that we use to take the white off can move our pigment out. Here I do have quite a large area of foliage, so I'll paint in the body just like that. Make my brush nice and damp, and just about every time I grab new pigment or I work in a new area, I do go and make sure my brush is nice and damp again. Because if it starts to get dry, we'll probably get larger brush strokes and an effect we're not crazy about. There we go. I'm also going over previous areas because, of course, all of that water that we're using is thinning our pigment and making our applications semi-transparent. So if you want it to be nice and stark, it's important that we go over areas a couple of times. With that said though, I think when a lot of people go over areas again, they say, oh, you know what, I've done this before, it's there, it's easy, I don't really have to worry about it, I'm just filling it in. And when you take that mentality, something really, really bad can happen, and that's larger strokes. Initially, you might make them really fine, sharp, exactly what they need to be, but when you go over it and you're not entirely cognizant of what you're doing, your process, why you're doing it, they can get larger. And when that happens, you lose that detail and that realism that you initially worked so hard for. So just because you're doing it again doesn't mean you can be more lax with it. It is something that's still going to require a great amount of attention and care. There is a lot of repetition in this painting, both in the background and in these trees. But that's not a bad thing. It's more practice, means you get to retain your skill, and just build on it. You also notice that as I'm doing this, some of these branches are coming down like that, as we would, naturally think about it, but some of them also work their way back up. And that is diversity. That is making your branches different and interesting. It's making it so that when you look at the painting and you look at a tree, you don't say, okay, I understand this tree immediately and I understand all of the trees. It means that there's change and movement, and that the viewer can stay in the painting longer because there's more to visually explore. It isn't all kind of predicated on the same rule and idea. So, I highly recommend being playful, or of course using the reference photo. I think that's why a lot of people do like to use reference photos. It's not necessarily so they get everything right or match it exactly. It's so you're exposed to just a myriad of new ideas that you wouldn't have had otherwise, and different ways of expanding upon the painting so that it's continuously changing and captivating. I'm personally not following the reference photo to a T, but I am using it for the main placements, the main sizing, and whenever I feel like something might be getting a little too repetitive, or I'm starting to kind of subconsciously fall into a trap of doing the same thing over and over again, I look over, I say, okay, what am I doing here? What is it doing? What can I add from its pool of aesthetics and line work? And then I work from there. This tree is really quite small, really quite thin, so we'll start like that. Then we'll make some smaller pieces that come out. There's a larger one over here I can see in the reference photo though, so I'll just expand upon that. And we'll just keep playing with it. There we go. I accidentally made that top area a little bit larger than I wanted to, and generally the best course of action to do there is to extend it to be longer and taper it up again. You really don't want the tops of a lot of these trees to be short and stumpy. And this one actually blends into the next tree, so that's fun. That means we have some overlap happening. I'll leave some openings in between the two, where you can still see that really beautiful blue sky. And it's just little decisions like this that are going to make the piece special and original. There we go. I think I'll head over here, darken a couple areas, maybe expand the top so it can be slightly more sharp. And now I'll head over here. I'm trying not to work in the same direction, left or right. I want to bounce around, and that way, if I do subconsciously start using the same technique over and over again, it's spaced out in the painting, and it won't be this noticeable, unfortunate application. Now this tree, I look at the reference photo and I notice that a lot of the branches aren't moving down, they're actually moving up. So I'm working up in both directions. And it's also important to remember that you don't want each side to look the same as the one before it, or rather on the other side. You want it to be changing. So keep it loose, make some branches abnormally long, some abnormally short. And this one actually moves into the next set as well. Now this one has lots of little holes in it, so I'll be tapping on more paint in this one rather than using brush strokes. And when I wash away all of this white, all of those little white spots you see in it will actually look like the blue sky. Now this area right here is essentially just silhouetted, so we can make that quite a bit more thick and dark. So here we are yet again right in the middle of the piece with this tree, and I wanted to show you up close what a lot of these very sharp applications look like. So I do need to expand these branches, so I'll make that incredibly small. You can see that I'm only touching the tip of the paintbrush to the canvas. I'm not trying to get the body of it in there. The second we do that, we really expand our brush stroke. And now I'm trying to make these little pieces of foliage leaf up at the end. And that's because generally with trees like this, they want to move upwards in those directions. But as they get more weight in the body of them, it tends to drag them down. But the end of them still wants to move up, so you start to get this half bell shape. It's a really easy way of thinking about it. Talk about that a lot in my How to Draw Trees for Beginners book, which you can find up on Etsy, but you can also get access to over on Patreon at the Alpine tier and above. I have all 5 of my ebooks up there, including Acrylics for Beginners, which is great for those of you who are just jumping into your first acrylic paintings. I also have a bunch of ebooks full of reference photos. So there's a lot up there, but if you haven't checked out How to Draw Trees, and you are a member, I highly recommend it. Put a lot of time and effort into that one. Now we're going to continue doing a little bit of that painting from afar. And I think it's really important that you do paint up close, but you also paint a little bit farther away, because you can actually take away a lot from each. When you're up close, you really are paying attention to that brush stroke, to that detail, and it's where you can really refine something. But the general motions, the general composition is best achieved from a little bit of a distance. So I like to paint really close to the canvas, but I also like to paint quite far away. Generally when I'm just blocking something in, getting the shape, the size, all of that good stuff, I like to be a bit farther away, and sometimes I even hold the brush like this so that I can stand farther away. And when I get in towards the details, then I get closer. But here we're starting a new tree, so I'm trying to be a bit farther away, and that's why I'm also moving the camera back for you to see it from a bit of a distance. There I'm going over areas numerous times, just filling in this tree here. The bottom really gets lost in with this other tree, so I'm going to create some openings that I see in the reference photo. These are quite easy to figure out thanks to that. Get some more Mars Black paint and fill in the bottom here. There we go. So I was just talking about how we need to diversify our trees and ensure that the sides aren't the same. We don't want them to be symmetrical. And this tree is actually an example of that. So I was looking over at the reference photo and I noticed that this side right here was very open. It had this large space right here. We have this one little piece that sticks out, but for the most part, it's really quite barren. The other side, however, is quite thick and elaborate. So this is going to come down here. We're going to create a much more thick area there. We'll have some little pieces that kind of fling back out. Here we'll have another thick area. You notice that it's going out farther than this side. closer to the top. We'll connect that. We still have a couple openings. You can see the white, but this is where it really gets interesting right down here. Now, obviously, trees don't just have branches and foliage going on the left and right hand side. Some of it comes forward, but in a silhouette, you don't really see that. So here, hypothetically, we have quite a lot of branches and foliage. We do still have those details, but it essentially blacks out that area as a whole. Where again, on the other side, we really don't see much of anything. And it continues down here, crossing paths with the foliage and the branches. So that's essentially one way of creating diversity. It's remembering that these trees are natural. That means they're going to be affected by weather. That means that they're going to have different wildlife living in them. It means that they're going to go through a lot of changes, and they're going to have these long lives that alter them. So as long as we're continuously and progressively making each tree original in one way or another, we're ensuring that our painting is something special. And I think that this is a painting that could honestly be done in maybe 30 minutes. Again, if you weren't doing all of the layers in the background and you weren't changing up your trees, you weren't using these smaller brushes, you weren't going over different layers a couple of times. But it's also a painting that you can spend, 4 or 5 hours on and make really, really incredible. The time you put in, it does pay off. It is worth it. I love this one. That's really good. Now, we were just talking about how this side of the tree is a bit more barren, this side of the tree is a bit more full, and we can kind of extend that idea into portions of the painting, where this side, you can see that we have a lot of space showing through, it feels very open. This side, it's not going to be like that. It's going to be much more full, because we're going to have these large clusters of trees all packed together, so we won't be able to see the sky showing through to that same extent. So with this, I'm actually going to start at the top here, and I'm going to work my way from larger tree to larger tree. Then, once we have a good amount of pigment covered, we can start working our way in. And we don't necessarily need to put openings in every spot, because this is going to create diversity. It's going to be more simple, but it's going to make the painting more elaborate. And that's a lesson that took me a long time to kind of figure out, but it's important to recognize when to put in detail and when to keep things a bit more simple, because if everything's highly detailed, the eye doesn't know where to focus. And by making sides like this more silhouetted dark pigment, sides like that can stand out and be really special. They also both create different feelings and emotions as well. Now, I know I personally love filling in areas like that. I feel like it's a real sense of accomplishment. You're applying all of this paint, it's flowing, it just feels good. However, it's important not to get carried away. We're now going to move on to this tree, and this tree, it's going to be a bit more detailed. It's going to have some openings in it, and it's important to not say, you know what, I love doing this, I'm just going to keep doing this all the way around. So I'm actually going to start here at the top of my tree by creating a nice sharp line. I'll start moving down this way, and I'm going to make the trunk here with a series of strokes rather than an individual stroke, because generally when you do a series of strokes, A, you can kind of control your movements better, but B, you get these little divots in and out, and it gives it this really natural look for a tree. I think when a lot of beginners start painting trees, they make the decision to do single strokes for that sort of thing, and generally it ends up looking a little cartoony or unnatural. If you can work those little divots and movements in, it can do so much for your painting. I'm then going to create some branches that are going to work their way out. And these two, as you can see, are working more that way, but remember, we do have branches protruding from the middle. And this is going to move up like this. It's actually moving in the same direction, horizontally out from the tree, but because we're under it, when we look up, it looks like it's in this direction. So we're going to add a number of them like this. Again, we're diversifying, we're painting this tree differently than we have the others. And then once we have those openings and those branches kind of worked in here, then we can say, okay, you know what? We'll put a cluster of foliage right here. And we'll have it come back, work its way over the tree. And we'll leave all of those openings that'll have this beautiful light working through them. Right now you can see all of this white conte, but once we clean it up, it'll look really beautiful. And then we can move that out towards the edge. I'm going to create some smaller little strands. I'll leave some openings. I'm using a lot of the white conte for those openings. That way it's very noticeable where they are, and it helps me plot where my other ones are going to be. Just a quick little tip there. Now, I guess we've been painting for quite some time. You've made it really far in the painting, and I think that shows a real level of dedication. So A, good for you. I'm proud of you. I'm sure if you're, listening, you're thinking about it, you're going to end up with a great painting at this point. And as a little point of honor, you can leave the comment, rather the phrase, starry night, in a comment, and I'll know you made it this far. Everybody else who made it this far will know you did so, and it'll be this special little thing. So go ahead right now, head to the comments, leave one, and find a way to work starry night in there. Something we've been doing in the last couple of paintings, and it's so neat to see the people who are making it far in these lessons, who are really dedicated, and the people who are continuously getting far and finding the kind of secret words in the later portions of the lesson. I'd also like to say a big thank you, as always, to our patrons for making this happen. As I always note, this channel is primarily fan-funded, and I'm only able to spend my time making these lessons each and every week because of the incredibly supportive, generous folks up over there. I do what I do because of them. Wouldn't be able to do it any other way, and I really appreciate it. It's pretty amazing that I get to create art and teach art each and every day, put out these videos for you guys, and again, that only happens because of those incredible people up there. So big thank you to you for supporting the channel, for making this happen. Big thank you to everyone who's just made it this far in the lesson. I do recognize that you make this channel what it is, and I really appreciate that. I feel like we've really started to make a great artistic community here. With that said, if you are new to the channel and new to the community, if you'd like to, you can help support the channel up over on Patreon. It's a great way to say thank you, but it's also a great way to get the traceables, the reference photos, a bunch of extra bonus lessons. I have all 5 of my ebooks up there. We have a private Facebook group where we all kind of share our artwork and help each other out. And I also do fun things like personalized art reviews at the higher tiers as well. So we have a lot going up over there. Highly recommend checking it out if you can. If not, that's entirely okay. Thank you for watching, sharing the videos, leaving comments. All of that does help as well. But, you know, check it out. There is a link in the description. I love how this is turning out. I feel like we really diversified. We had this tree, and then this one was quite different with the opening, and then we had this much more dense area with slightly more distant trees that look smaller, and then this one we have the opening more so in the middle. It's that sort of thing that's really going to make this special. And if you think it looks good now, just wait till you see it once we take out all of the white behind the trees that we have with Conte. It's really going to get quite interesting. Now this next one is quite high up, so I think I'm going to move the camera. That way you can see exactly what we're doing. So as you can see, now we're painting a tree that looks quite small. It's not actually small, it's just that it's a little bit farther away from this one. So it's going to appear smaller because of perspective. But this tree actually wasn't in the reference photo. I talk about the reference photo a lot because it's incredibly useful, but I also like to iterate on it. I like to make changes. I like to take my artistic liberties and make these things my own. Because while the photograph can provide a lot of information I innately wouldn't think of, I can also interject pieces of myself by deviating from it. And that's exactly what we're doing here. Initially there was this wide open space on this side and this side, and I wanted to make it feel a bit more cozy. So we're just throwing in this smaller tree right here. It's not big. I liked the initial reference photo a lot. I didn't want to completely change it compositionally or how it kept the eye moving, where it put focus. But I knew I wanted something here as well. So I'm going back, doing a couple of applications, making sure that we have an opaque tree. It's small, we want it to be covered with fairly thick paint. There we go. And we'll move it just over that star. That worked out really well. But I think we need to diversify it a little bit. So I'll just extend a branch right here, put another little branch there. It's this tiny little thing, but subconsciously it makes it so you don't initially figure out the tree the first time you look at it. You have to think about it a little bit. And that's always the goal. Notice how this one comes up this way from here, and then this one comes up this way from here. So again, they're not starting at the same point. They're changing. I think we just need a bit more water for that sharp tip. The smaller the brush you have, the better. The more detail you can apply, the better. I give you suggestions for brushes. I tell you what I use, but always feel like you can use something different if you feel like you're more comfortable with it, or you can just render a better result. Generally, the smaller the brush, the more detail you can incorporate. I do have to use brushes that allow me to complete these in a reasonable amount of time just for the sake of making it into a lesson and a tutorial. But you know, you can always add and build on these things with smaller brushes. There we go. Now I'm going to head into this side and we'll continue working on these silhouettes. Now we're heading over into the left-hand side again, and this tree is going to be quite interesting because we're going to adopt the ideas that we had in this larger tree. So with this, I'm going to start with a fairly watery mixture. I'm going to head to the top of the tree, figure out where that is. I think that'll be right about here. I'm going to start from that peak and through a litany of strokes we'll move down. I'll start applying more pressure with my brush, which will expand the bristles. which will create a larger trunk down here at the bottom. It's a very natural way of making it taper. And then I'll head back up and just make sure that initial application is nice and thick. As I move up, I use less and less pressure. That way we get that nice sharp point. But now what I want to do is create a lot of openings in the middle. So yet again, I'm going to start creating these branches that come out from the center of the piece. We're not going to have a lot of foliage kind of touching the edges on this one. It's going to be a little bit farther out. And this is another tree that I did a lot of Conte drawing with. So it's going to look a little messy, but we will clean it up and it'll look great in the end. I definitely feel like the drawings are worth the occasionally temporary messy look. Let's get you a little bit closer for the next step. So here we are, a little bit closer than we were before, grabbing more of that pigment, and I'll start to create my foliage around a lot of these openings. So I'm staying more towards the edge, and rather than just tapping all the way across, let's again start thinking. We want the ends to kind of leaf up, and we want them to come in so it's like a bell shape. So there it's coming in. We'll add a little bit of a leaf up there. We'll create an area that's a bit more dense. Looking over at the reference photo, it kind of expands right there. And occasionally it can come into the middle, but we don't want it to for the most part. Then at the edge, yet again, I'm making sure that it moves upwards. There we go. As we get towards the top here, there simply isn't enough visual space for those openings, so we can make that more dense. But we don't want the sides to be exactly the same, so I will leave a slight opening right there. Now we'll head over to this side. We have an opening right there, so I'll create a bridge between those. Keep it interesting. Just like that. Have it come down like a bell and then leaf up. Now I'll fill in this small spot. That way it's not hyper consistent. You notice that some branches are much closer than others. That's also important. Grab more pigment. I'm definitely using a lot of water in this one because it does have a lot of very small strokes, and that really aids the process, but again it does make things semi-transparent, so make sure that you do go over a number of these spots a couple of times if you're working with as much water as I am. There we go. In the reference photo, these two touched, but we have so many touching on the other side, I think I'm going to leave them apart just a little bit. And then I'll make that slightly more dense right there. That way we don't have two massive openings in the same way. So here's a little bit of a wider shot where you can see all of these different but similar trees together. At this point, I feel like it is really starting to come together. I love the way this is looking. It actually looks a lot better than I initially anticipated, and I'm getting really excited to do the other side. But before we do that, I'm personally just going to go in and fill these two in, just following the drawing in the reference photo. Then I'll flip the canvas and we'll start working on the other larger trees, which will have more notable definitive features. So, as you can see, the bottom half of the canvas is now covered with our silhouettes of trees, and now you have two options. The first is to actually paint all of these trees upside down, which isn't actually a crazy thing. Generally, when people are painting portraits and they're having troubles kind of lining things up, putting subjects where they need to be, a lot of instructors will actually recommend that they flip their canvas and their reference photo. That way they look at it as simple shapes rather than things that we feel like we're aware of what they are, and incorrectly so. So painting upside down can actually be a very beneficial thing when you feel a little confused by a subject, or when you feel like you're doing something and you're not quite sure why it's not working. But if you feel very confident in your ability to paint trees and you really enjoy doing so down here, then it can be actually quite advantageous to just flip it and start working, which is what we're going to do right now. So I will simply undo that, take the canvas, flip it like so, put that back down, tighten it, and now I will get you right up close and we'll continue with this tree, which is actually quite different from any of them that we've done here before. Now we're going to continue here with that same round pointed brush, and we'll grab some Mars Black, move that down on our palette, wipe off the excess pigment and grab a little bit of additional water, come back, grab that, and I'll start at the tip. However, this time we're not going to have an individual tip for this tree like we did on all of the others. This one is going to be a cluster of foliage because this tree is close to the point where we actually don't see the top. It's probably right here, but it's pointing directly up. And so we instead see this area that's kind of flaring out. So the middle, it's coming up. It's probably like this, and it ends right there. But instead we see all of the foliage that moves to the left, right, diagonally. And it's a rather different visual, which is great. That's really what we want. We've already painted, between 5 large trees and, probably 10 smaller ones. So any new idea or aesthetic is quite welcome at this point. So I'm starting on the edges. You can see that this moves that way, then it starts to move that way. These start moving that way. And then eventually, we find ourselves at the next cluster. The larger amount of foliage, again, starts to protrude here. And then it'll come back in. So, yet again, you can see those brush strokes. Pay attention to the way I'm moving my brush. And we can mirror that on the other side. Now this is a very different technique, so you can see that the pigment that I'm using is very watered down and transparent. Generally, when you're trying something new, it can be useful to go in with a very watery mixture. That way, if it isn't exactly what you want, it isn't too noticeable and you can work over it quite easily. Then, once you have it the way you actually want it and you're ready to commit, then you can come back in, add those additional, more thick layers. You can also occasionally leave an opening or two. I did notice 2 openings in the reference photo. One is right around here, so I'll block that in. And then we have another up here, and then there's another one there-ish. The middle is going to be quite dense, so I can just move pigment into here quite liberally. But I'm still keeping in mind the way my stroke needs to be made. And I'm still moving out in those directions that we initially started with. Also heading back up and fixing the less opaque areas. So if you were to look at this tree individually, out of context with the rest of the trees, it would probably look a little strange. But that's okay, because when we do move the camera back and you see it in context with the rest of the piece, it will make significantly more sense and really fall into place. With that said, I'm just going to go ahead and do a couple more layers on it, make sure it's nice and thick, and then we'll move on to the next original tree. Now, this tree right here in the reference photo has a similar top to this one, but I want a bit more of a cohesive nature between this side of the painting and the other. So I'm going to give the majority of the body this look, but I'm going to give the top a slight peak. That way it does again feel cohesive. So this goes back to what I was saying when I was talking about taking artistic liberties and deviating slightly from a reference photo. So we're going to take the main idea, but we're going to iterate. I'm starting with that smaller stroke at the top. I'm making all of these strokes down, applying more pressure, building up that base, and now we can go back in, start applying some extra details. So we're going to do some little pitter patters at the top here, make sure that the sides aren't emerging at the same point. And then I'm going to start now to make it more like this in the way that my reference photo suggests. So it starts to have quite a lean over here to the left-hand side, and then it comes back in, there's a bit of an opening, and then it connects. So there we have the start. Then we have slightly more of an opening and more of a protruding piece. And it doesn't seem to protrude much farther than that. So now we're working yet again quite close to the body of the tree. And that's something that's quite interesting to take note of, especially when you are working on pieces with very different perspectives. Like this one. Generally with a painting you're looking out at something, and perspective makes things get smaller in the background as a whole, where with this the tops of the trees look a little bit smaller because they're farther away, so it's the same subject kind of stretched. Here there aren't really openings in the reference photo, but I want one or two just to make it interesting. There we go. And you can still see a lot of that white from the Conte showing through. We will go back up to the top fairly soon because that should be just about dry, and we'll clean that up. But I did want to make sure that it had some time before we went ahead and did that. We'll probably do that after we finish up this tree. Maybe we'll do those two as well, just because they're so close. Here we have a larger opening. We have a branch going through it. Nice and easy. Go back in, thicken that branch. There we go. And the rest of this is really quite dense until we get to this opening right here. And this is actually quite fun because it's a bit different than anything we've done. And I know we've been painting the silhouettes of trees for probably an hour now, but in each tree we are doing something different, and that's really important to know. We aren't just painting trees, we're not doing the same thing over and over again. We are looking for different ways of doing similar things. Here I'm going in with a little bit of a tap, I'm leaving lots of openings, but I'm essentially going to leave this maze of open sky pieces. And that's because this area is dense, but it doesn't have too much foliage. There's foliage there, but a lot of it's see-through. Well, the foliage isn't actually see-through. There are a lot of parts in between the foliage that are showing that sky. But it's a different application than what we've done before, And it definitely makes this tree something individual. Now, before we continue with our trees, I am going to head back up to the top of the painting, which is actually the bottom of the painting, and I'm going to clean up some of that conte. And to do that, I do need some clean water. So I'm going to take this opportunity to clean my brushes, clean my water, and make sure that we are ready for the next step with a non-diluted eraser, essentially. So with that, this is your friendly reminder to keep things clean, and we will continue in just a second. So now, as you can see, when we move back up here, there's all of these little markings that aren't part of our sky. They're simply our drawing. And I didn't want to take care of them earlier because if we went in with a brush with a lot of water, we'd probably move this pigment around and thin it out, which we didn't want to do. So I waited for it to fully dry. Now I'm going to take a smaller brush. This is a round-headed brush, but it doesn't have to be. I'm just using this because it doesn't kind of take up a lot of space. It'll let me be fairly precise with my applications, and the only reason I want it to be relatively precise is so that we don't pick up a lot of it and start moving it around together, at which point it might become a little visible. So we're just going to take this slow. I'm going to make sure that brush is nice and wet. Then I'll go over an area like that. I'll work in circles, and if you feel like there's a bit of a residue, you can just work that off with your finger. I'm using a little bit of pressure, and I'm just cleaning up all of these little spots here. And this is why drawing with Conte over a canvas that already has a lot of pigment on it is so convenient. You get to use pigments like white, and you don't have to worry about it showing through later, about erasing it, about it hindering your pigment. And just like this, we can make things look so much more clean and tidy. I actually took a little bit of a break when my partner came home, and she noted it. She really liked it, but the edges of the trees looked a little messy with the white. I said, I know. It's meant to at this point. We will clean that up. But it's just a good reminder to clean it up. And it's a good reminder that using a material like Conte is fantastic because we can clean it up. Where with others we might need to use an eraser or something else that might leave permanent marks and render a messy piece forever, right? There we go. Please excuse the drill currently being used by my neighbor. They, I think they like to work with wood. They use the drill quite frequently in the day. I think they also have a creative stay-at-home job, which is really nice, but I do apologize if you do hear that background drilling sound. So we cleaned up the top of the painting, and now it's time to head back down to the bottom, where yet again we do see those little white spots. I do want to wait a bit longer before we clean this up, and I'd also like to do it as a whole once these are done. With that said, you can also see a little bit of a blue line in here as well that I used for my grid. I decided on that color just because it was so similar to the sky that I'd be able to see it if I really looked, but if I accidentally didn't erase part of it, it would really just blend into the background. With that said, I am going to take more of our Mars Black, move that out on our palette, grab some extra water, and what's really interesting about these is that this is a tree, this is a tree, this is a tree, but they're all connected. These two are connected right here, and I'll draw a little line just so you can see. These two are connected up here. So yet again, it's diverse, it's interesting, and it's keeping the painting captivating as you move visually through it. Now, this one is going to have a bit more of a rounded top in that it's not going to have this sharp edge, but the one next to it will have that sharp edge. So we're starting off with something that is a bit larger and more visually impactful, bold right here. And then we'll have something that's a bit more clean and sleek right here. It's worth noting that in the reference photo, both of these have a top like that, but again, I do want that diversity, and I also want it to be cohesive with the other applications that we made at the top there. So I'm taking the ideas that I like in that these are all connected, and I'm iterating on the things that I feel could be worked on for compositional purposes or just balancing in general. Here we'll grab more pigment, head back down into this one, and we're going to have a fair number of openings over on the left hand side here. They'll be relatively small, so I'll just work this middle area in, but I'll occasionally miss little spots. Just like that. And this area actually gets quite loose at the bottom here. So I'll just fill that in like that. We'll make sure that we have a thick middle because we are still going to have that nice base in the trunk. And then we'll start again after skipping this area and deliver a good amount of pigment. As we jump into the other side, we're going to make it less poppy. It's going to be slightly more thin. It's not going to protrude to the same extent. So here we have more of a consistent movement, as you can see. This one, it has these bumps. This one, it's full of bumps, but they're significantly more subdued and consistent. I think the worst thing you can do when painting trees is in your head come up with what the perfect tree looks like and then paint that, and then paint it again, and then paint it again. Because after you've done it once, it's going to look fake the second time. So creating things that you wouldn't naturally think are aesthetic or ideal become really important and actually really integral to the painting. And that's why trees like this, which are a little misshapen, are just so special. And it's not only that they make the more naturally shaped ones look more beautiful in comparison. I think it's just that the diversity is beautiful. Here I'm doing a lot of that leafing. I'm creating a good number of openings. I made these two connect at that same spot here on the branch, and I quickly remedied that by adding another piece right up here. That way it didn't match that side. It's easy to fall into those traps, but you can also work your way out. Here we're going to start to get a little bit bigger, but we're not going to get too much bigger because I do want some open space in between this spot, because right above it we have the very silhouetted area that's incredibly dense. And we don't want to do the same thing twice, as we were just talking about. I will, however, go back and add some extra small little details like this. Maybe a branch here and there, kind of holding it all together. It's turning out really well. Almost left an opening there, but I saw that I had one there, so I said, okay, you know what, we have to fill that space. We did, and it worked. Now, this is a piece where you could definitely add a light source be it the light coming down on the trees, illuminating the tops of them, or a campfire or something at the bottom that illuminates the bottom, and then they get darker as they descend upwards. When I was searching for reference photos, I did see a couple versions like that, and I thought they were really interesting, but they didn't have as elaborate skies. And if we were to put that into this piece, I think it would just quickly become overcomplicated. I was talking about this with my partner, and it's one of those things where you have to weigh what that detail is worth to you. Because I think as a beginner, and I know I did this for years, I just thought, you know what, more detail? Excellent. Yes, let's do it. Let's make the painting even better, even more elaborate. Give the viewer more to look at. And while initially that makes sense, right? The more there is, the more captivating subjects there are, the more the viewer is going to get invested and find something they like. But in all actuality, it can be a distraction, and it can lead the eye away from where you want it, and it can unbalance the piece, or it could simply just give the piece no balance at all. So it's definitely one of those things where you have to say, what do you want your painting to invoke? What mood, what feeling, what is the purpose of it, right? And I think if you find that extra detail really doesn't add to it or even hinders that initial idea, then it's something to stay away from. Just a good thing to think about when you're considering heavily elaborating on a piece of artwork or dramatically changing the amount of detail or lighting in it. Generally, lighting has a massive impact on the way a piece makes you feel, and that's why it's so important to consider. There we go. Now I will let this dry and clean up all of these little edges. I'll also probably go back to some of the other areas and just make sure that pigment's nice and opaque. So, as you can see, I let my trees dry. I went back in with a wet brush, cleaned up the conte, flipped the canvas, and now here we have our finished Starry Night Sky scene. And before we go, I really would like to reiterate the fact that this is a relatively simple composition, it's a simple color palette, and it's a painting that honestly could be done in about 20 minutes. You could do a single layer for the stars, you could do a single tree and then just repeat it over and over again, but in the end you're going to end up with a fine painting, but it's not going to be something special or something that's continuously captivating. And so this is a friendly reminder that taking the extra time, doing the additional layers, adding the extra diversity within the trees will make a massive difference in the painting, and it'll make it something special, something you can really feel proud about. We've been doing a lot of really elaborate seascapes lately on the channel, and that does involve these very complex color palettes, mixes. It's this application and the subjects that are always changing. And I think this was a great lesson to do because it kind of brought us back to the roots of painting. What really can make a great painting isn't necessarily a hyper-complex color palette or a continuously changing composition. Really, it's about refined applications, layers that are built properly, balancing things, and keeping things relatively interesting. So I'm incredibly pleased with this piece. It is more simple, but it's also complex in a lot of really interesting ways, and I really appreciate you just taking the time here to be with me today. Congratulations on making it this far in the lesson. That's always a really special thing. Good for you. Giving you a virtual pat on the back. And remember to use the keyword in the comment section. That way I know you got this far, so it'll point of honor. But with that, I think next week, and I could be wrong here, but I think next week we are going to do a portrait painting. I haven't started it. I need to see how that goes first, if I'll be able to finish it on time. But make sure that you are subscribed, but more importantly, that you hit the bell button. That way you don't miss an episode, and I really look forward to that. Of course, I would also like to say a big thank you yet again to all of the people supporting the channel up over on Patreon for making lessons like this happen. Honestly, wouldn't be able to do it without you each and every week, and I'm incredibly proud of the community we're building. I love seeing the artwork that's made. I love seeing the comments and ideas. This is actually suggested by one of our patrons. We put it up in a poll. It ended up winning that poll for a little while. It's a really strange poll right now. I did a painting last week that I thought won, and then this painting overtook it, and now another painting has overtaken that. So, we'll see what happens, but on the note of Patreon, I suppose if you are new to the channel, remember up there you can get the traceable, you can get the reference photos, you can get the exclusive access to our Facebook group where we do share our artwork, all of my ebooks. So a lot of fun things up there. I definitely recommend going and checking it out. There will be a link in the description. But again, above all, I hope that you had a great time. I hope you feel like you learned something. You can walk away from this feeling a bit more confident with painting your trees and your starry skies, and I hope you have a wonderful time painting. So thank you so much for stopping by. I will see you next week with a brand new painting lesson. And above all, as always, stay creative.